How much do you know about your ancestry? About where your family comes from? About the language they spoke? The stories they told, the music they listened to, the gods they worshipped, the home they lived in, the clothes they wore? Really, think about this for a minute. How much do you actually know? How did they dance? Did they marry? What were their values? And how far back does this knowledge go for you? Does your family tree go back 3 generations? 7? More? Are there records on Ellis Island or Angel Island of your family's arrival in the United States? Did they come as refugees across the border to the south, or as refugees on the Mayflower? As an enslaved person, or as the person who enslaved them? Were your ancestors natives of this land who survived the genocide of the colonizers? Were they colonizers? Or did they come later from a country they had lived in for generations? What do you know about who you are? There's no Ancestry.com record of my family tree. I looked. My grandparents aren't in it. My mother isn't in it. Everything I know about where my people come from is what I've learned from my elders. Oral history. And I don't know anything about the Philippines before it was colonized. Much of its indigenous history was erased. So like Ancestry.com, it seems only white cultures get to have their history recorded in America and the Philippines. And I suspect just about everywhere colonizers have been. Here's what I do know about who I am. I'm Filipino. My 18-year-old single mother immigrated to the US while pregnant before I was born and moved in with her sister, who was already here in DC. She's the youngest of 8 children, of Rafael and Refugio, born in Manila, very Catholic. Her parents were originally from the province of Sorsogon, a town called Bicol, and were of Spanish and Chinese and Filipino descent. They moved to the big city when my grandfather began his career in politics, eventually becoming a congressman. My father was one of 4 children. I know he was mostly of Spanish heritage, that he was 5'11", was a chef, and that's about all I know about him and his family. I don't know the names of his parents, and I don't go by his last name. I don't know anything about his history because he was never in my life. I'm American. I was born and raised in Maryland, which was strange to me as a child because nothing about my life seemed to be like the normal American lives we learned about in school or saw on TV. My teachers didn't look or sound like my mother. My friends' families didn't worship like my family. My elders spoke a different language, which they never taught to me or my cousins. And they spoke English with thick accents that embarrassed us because we were American. Such a funny thing to be told by my family that they are Filipino, but that I am American. To grow up thinking that I was somehow different from my mother. My mother was the most beautiful and wonderful person in the world. To be told I'm different from her was very confusing. If I'm not like my mother, and I'm not like Americans, who am I? Big thoughts for a little kid. Our family was devoutly Catholic. Most Filipinos are. The Philippines is a Catholic country, another remnant of Spanish colonization. We went to church every week, and I bought into it with my whole heart until my teenage years. In 5th grade, when my mother was out of town and I had to stay with my aunt, she'd take me to her Filipino rosary group. Every spring, the other kids there would practice traditional Filipino dance. All the other kids' families were part of the Filipino Cultural Society, and they would put on a Filipino folk arts show. I would act like I wasn't into it because I did ballet and didn't have time. But I was secretly jealous. They never asked me to join, nor was I ever encouraged by my mother. They would practice the tinikling and I would watch, fascinated, envious of the traditional clothes that I didn't own and didn't even know what they were called. I didn't know how to articulate what I was feeling, this ignorance of my history, this sadness, this longing to know. Notice the ongoing theme in my life, not belonging to or being wanted by, well, anyone. I was alone in so many ways. An only child with no father and a mother who traveled all the time to provide for me. I spent most of my childhood staying with cousins who had both parents, married, and at home. Loneliness is difficult to bear as an adult, but as a child, it's mind-altering. It was hard. Alone, I searched for refuge and peace. I adapted to survive. A brown girl in a white school, white town, white world. I escaped into books and TV shows. Play, dance, and music were my constant companions. I knew from a very young age that I'd be a performer. I dreamed I'd be in a band called the Rainbows and painted my face with watercolors and ran around my house singing made-up songs with my broom guitar. I spent a year wearing a curly red wig and singing "The Sun'll Come Out Tomorrow" while riding on the back of a big stuffed dog. I was going to be the first and the best Filipina little orphan Annie. I started ballet when I was 4. By 2nd grade, I was in school plays and in drama club. By 6th grade, I was in the all-county choir. From 8th grade onwards, I got progressively bigger roles in school plays. Performance was a respite, a peaceful place where I had control, and it was also a means for getting what I wanted, which was acceptance. I was never a popular kid in my childhood. I got made fun of because of how I looked, gangly and bony and brown with jet black hair surrounded by alabaster-skinned, rosy-cheeked blondes, redheads, and brunettes. I'm a brunette, I tell myself. But that's not true when everyone in your culture has the same hair color. Am I right? And sure, there were other Asian kids, but I didn't fit in with them either. No one knew what or where the Philippines were. Kids made fun of the food I brought to school because it wasn't American and it wasn't Chinese, which was the only acceptable Asian food in my town. So I stopped bringing delicious leftover adobo and rice and forced myself to like Lunchables. And let's be honest, they're gross and so bad for you. But white kids ate it, so I wanted it. Can you imagine? I had home-cooked, heartwarming adobo, and instead I ate Oscar Mayer processed meat and dry white crackers. I was literally eating whiteness, trying to make myself whiter in the process. Similarly, I thought excelling at performance would make me more acceptable and at the very least would help me fit in better, because I could just pretend to be something I wasn't. I could go along with the crowd. I could act like everyone else and blend in. So it should come as no surprise that by high school, I decided I wanted to pursue acting as a career. In my junior year, I auditioned for and was accepted into a famous performing arts high school. We moved out of the sticks and into DC. I was 16 and ready for life in the big city. At first, I loved it. I loved being around other artists. It was the first time I found collaborators, accomplices, peers, friends who didn't bat a lash at my weird fascination with British accents and campy musicals, who I could talk to about art and philosophize about the meaning of life. But I very quickly became disenchanted by the curriculum. The more I studied, the less I saw myself in my chosen craft. I'm being told to rehearse, to be prepared, so I can earn a career. But nothing I read or watched included anyone who looked like me or lived my culture. There was no clear path for me, no history to look to, no mentors to guide me, just overwhelming pressure to yet again transform myself into something that I wasn't in order to succeed. I was frustrated and isolated at school, so I started focusing on finding excitement in the city. I heard about these underground parties happening downtown and in Baltimore. On a Friday night, when Mom was out of town, a couple of friends and I headed down to Southeast and got in line at the Capitol Ballroom for a rave called Buzz. We had the dumbest fake IDs and were terrified we'd get arrested, but the bouncers didn't care and just waved us in. And we stepped into a new world, a new consciousness. In that club, I found community. Raves were diverse. So many people in the club were Black or Latinx or Asian. It was the only place where white people were not centered at all. The music was rooted in Black culture. Everyone danced. People wore whatever they wanted and felt free to express their sexualities fully and without judgment. There were deaf students from Gallaudet dancing right by the speakers. They could feel the beat of the music and we all boogied down together. It was like church. The DJ was the priest and we were there to worship through dance. It was all about connection and spirituality. It was about expanding your mind and finding collective ecstasy. There was even a mantra, a prayer, that was the root of rave culture. Plur. Peace, love, unity, respect. We were space hippies. I slept during the day and went to parties at night and stopped doing schoolwork. Got a job with the sole purpose of earning money to go to parties. I fought with my mother, if I saw her. At one point, I was at a party 5 nights out of the week, from Wednesday to Sunday, and what began as a beautiful exploration of consciousness and community started to morph into escapism. I lost control. I cut class, started failing beyond repair, and ended up dropping out of school.
My mother tried to have multiple interventions, but I ran away from home. I was doing way too many drugs with my newfound family. We thought we lived outside the law, and recklessness took over reason. We did so many stupid things. I have no idea how we survived. I put myself in dangerous situations so often, you'd think I had a death wish. Looking back, I obviously did. I even overdosed. Twice. We thought we'd live forever as we slowly killed ourselves. And then one day, my best friend called me crying. She wasn't able to get in touch with her boyfriend, and it had been a couple of days since she'd heard from him. She couldn't call the police for help because he was a drug dealer and had large quantities of various substances stashed at his place. We called everyone we knew, and no one had seen him or heard if he'd left town. The next day, she contacted his landlord, and they went to his apartment and found him dead. Overdosed on heroin. He'd been lying there for 3 days. Devastated, she had to stay and dodge questions about drugs and contraband from police officers while they cleaned up and removed his body. She was 17 years old. I realized that in that moment that if I stayed in this scene, I was going to die. I needed to get out. But I dropped out of school. I had ruined my life, And my future? How do you start over at 17?
By going to the source. I went home to my mother and told her that I wanted to move to the Philippines. My grandfather had suffered a heart attack earlier that year, and she said she wanted to move back to be close to him and help nurse him back to health, but didn't want to disrupt my life. I told her that didn't matter anymore, because I had already disrupted my life on my own. So, we decided together that we would move there, as a family, to heal our relationship, to save my life. I got a second chance. I repeated my junior year at the American school, which felt just like school here, only better because it was a private school with lots of funding on a gorgeous city campus. There was an IB theater program. I started acting again. I got cast in the school play. I became obsessed with technique. I began to believe that I was good at it, instead of needing people to tell me I'm good at it. I stopped performing for them, and I started performing for me. I reconnected with my mother. I spent time with my grandparents, my cousins. I visited the town in the province where my grandparents came from. I learned Tagalog. My teachers spoke my mother's language. Everyone on TV looked like her. I ate the food my mother grew up with, which was available to buy at my school cafeteria. Fuck you, Lunchables! It was a very affirming time.
And yet I was still an outsider. I was a third culture kid. My experience wasn't the same as my cousins who were born there and went to Filipino schools. I was an American with a thick accent, going to the American school with other American kids of all ethnicities, experiencing life in the Philippines as expats. And I didn't escape the oppressive effects of whiteness. Colonization is embedded in Filipino culture. And ironically, my appearance isolated me in mother's homeland. I have lighter skin and am much taller than most Filipinos. And people stared at me everywhere I went. In a tropical country where women avoid the sun and spend lots of money on skin whiteners, I was considered beautiful simply because I was fair and tall. My entire life up until that point, I was told that I was not white. And now whiteness was put upon me by Filipinos with darker skin. I traveled to the other end of the globe, and I still didn't fit in. I began to understand colorism, and that white supremacy was universal. It was the first time in my life that I felt and understood privilege. My family belonged. My family had power. There was a sense of security that I had never known before.
And with that safety net, I thrived. In the 2 years I was in Manila, I went from druggy high school dropout to honor roll student with a 3.7 GPA. I got accepted into multiple schools in New York, and I took the offer with a merit scholarship that covered nearly all my tuition. I acted in my first professional theater production. I worked as a model. I still went to raves. They were great in Manila, but I never lost control. I had found a balance. I felt supported. And when it came time to go back home to the States, I was ready. Off I went to New York City to live my dream. A little scared, but eager for a brighter future. I didn't know everything about who I was. I definitely didn't know as much as I wanted to. I still don't. The way society perceives me is not what defines me, but this is what I do know. I am Filipino. I am American. I am the unique and beautiful and powerful alchemy of my family history and my personal history. This knowledge is enough. It has to be enough. To be my fuel. To create a history for my children and my children's children. To live a full life with my family and my found family to live my life with purpose.